Greetings out there in YouTube land. In today's video I'm going to attempt to cover a rather complex topic. It's partially in response to some inquiries I've gotten about vacuum tubes and why some tubes have one grid, some have two, some have three, and why triodes tend to be used as preamp tubes in guitar amps and as phase inverters and not as output tubes. I learned quite a bit in my preparation for this video, and I hope I can pass on as much of that as possible to you.
Ready?
So let's get started with a discussion of the evolution of the modern vacuum tube as used in a guitar amplifier. The first and simplest form is the triode. It was invented in 1906 by a man named Lee DeForest, and he called it the Audion tube. As you can see, it has simply a cathode, control grid, and a plate, three independent components, and therefore the name triode. Let's review briefly how the triode functions, and in so doing see why it makes an excellent preamplification tube and phase inverter. Here we're going to inject a small, weak, like a guitar signal into the grid of the tube. We have a very highly charged plate up here. It might be, say, 250 volts positive. So it's very appealing to the electrons that are going to be boiling off the cathode as we heat it. So we're generating electrons here and attracting them up here. They want to make this trip. They want to pass from cathode to plate. Now, in between our electron generator and our electron vacuum, we put in this grid that's sort of like a charged chain link fence. When the grid is charged positive by the incoming guitar signal, and the signal from the guitar, small and weak, but shifts up here to the positive region, then the grid will not only allow electrons to pass, but encourage them because it's actually attracting them. So the electrons then will pass in high numbers over here to the plate and will show up as a very, very negative and much larger signal on the plate. So as you can see, positive input to the grid yields a very high negative charge on the plate. Now, by the same token, and the part that's generally not discussed, if the electrons are allowed to flow in great numbers because the signal is positive, then the plate, of course, will become negative because of the influx of electrons. The cathode will become positive because of the absence of electrons. You let the electrons flow, you end up with a negative plate and a positive cathode signal, both equal and much, much larger than the input signal. The fact that they're larger is what gives the tube its amplification capability. And by the same token, when the guitar signal shifts to negative, it will hinder or impair, repel the electrons as they try to pass from the cathode to the plate, and will end up making the plate become relatively positively charged because of the absence of electrons that couldn't get to it. And the cathode, because the electrons were held here on the cathode, will have a very negative charge. So as you can see, the dramatic increase in signal size will give us our amplification, and the opposite phase of the plate and cathode give us our phase inversion capability. The tube has some very strong virtues, but also some really strong limiting factors. Let's talk about its virtues first. Because of its simplicity, it has probably the lowest distortion of all amplification tubes. It doesn't tend to produce many third-order harmonics. Now, that's a rather complex issue in its own right, but let's just say that odd-numbered harmonics don't sound good. Even order harmonics do, particularly in guitar amps. And because of its very, very low distortion rate, it has no need for a negative feedback loop to compress it and keep it within a non-distortion range. These tubes can run then without negative feedback, produce extremely high fidelity with very low distortion, and whatever distortion they do produce is generally even order harmonics and is pleasant to the ear. The downsides are at least two. Number one, as you can see here, this looks sort of like a capacitor in that we have two charged plates within a single container. And yes, there is a great deal of internal capacitance, or what they call inter-electrode capacitance, within triode tubes. It can be measured at about 3.8 picofarads, so that if you input a high-frequency signal to the grid, it is like a short circuit to that high frequency. It jumps straight across and passes out of the plate. Now, in audio amps, this isn't a huge problem, but in radio frequency, which is about 1,000 times greater than audio frequency, it's a huge problem. So the triode is limited in the frequencies it can handle because it has this tendency to high inter-electrode capacitance. And second, there is no shielding between the plate and the control grid. Recall that we're going to insert a very small weak signal onto the control grid, and that is going to regulate the flow of electrons through the tube and create the much larger alternating current signal on the plate. I think you can see that the proximity of this very large out-of-phase alternating current signal up here on the plate is going to have a very negative effect on the control grid. And that's why our plate voltage is restricted. We do not want to develop so large an AC signal on this plate that it will adversely affect the function of the control grid. Now, triodes come in two different forms. The first and oldest and simplest is a single triode within one tube. A good example of that is the 6SJ5, which we'll look at in just a second. The second type we'll discuss is the duo triode, in which, because of the simplicity of the triode, they found it was very, very efficient to combine two triodes within one glass tube. In this case, the 12AX7, probably the most common of all the duo triodes that you'll encounter when you deal with guitar amplifiers. But as you can see, two triodes within that single glass envelope. Now, this is a page from an old Sylvania tube manual, and I highly recommend, if you are involved in any way with tube guitar amps, that you get one of these old manuals. If you don't have one already, you can find them at garage sales sometimes, on eBay. They're usually fairly inexpensive, but they have all the data you'll ever need to know about virtually every type of vacuum tube you'll ever encounter. Now, as we saw, because of the lack of any shielding between the grid and the plate in the triode, the amplification factor of the tube is limited to a maximum of about 100. The amplification factor is abbreviated as the Greek letter mu, and we'll see that the companies have produced duo triodes primarily in all different amplification factors. Most of these you've probably heard of or seen, but it allows you to pick tubes for your preamp or for your phase inverter which have an ideal amplification factor for your purposes. The maximum is the 12AX7 with an amplification factor of 100, which sounds like it's very high, but it's not, as we will see. Let's take a look at a couple triodes. On the left is a metal enclosed 6J5, which is the earliest form. On the right is the glass enclosed 6J5, a little more recent form. The metal enclosure serves as a shield for the contents of the tube and is connected to pin 1 and grounds through the socket to the chassis. So we have here a built-in metal shield for the tube. Another characteristic is the base has 8 pins. If they don't use certain pins in different positions, they might eliminate the pins, but the socket will always have 8 holes. So these are called octal tubes. The 12AX7, as we see here in the amperex form, actually does consist of 2 separate triodes. As you can see, inside here there are 2 completely separate triodes located within this single glass envelope. The tube is quite compact and it has 9 pins instead of 8. So let's have a brief review of the triode. We see it's the earliest and simplest of all vacuum tubes, invented back in 1906. It comes in 2 different forms. It can be a single triode, as in the very early 6J5, or it can be in the duo triode form, which we see in the 12A series of tubes. It has some very, very strong positive characteristics in that its distortion level is probably the lowest of all amplification tubes. The harmonics it produces are even order, not odd order, which are unpleasant. And because of its very, very high fidelity, low distortion, there is no need for a negative feedback loop to come back and reduce its tendencies to distort. The downside is it has a lot of inter-electrode capacitance, which makes it a short circuit for high frequencies, and there is no shielding between the plate and the grid, and therefore we're very restricted in the amount of voltage we can apply to the plate, and therefore the amount of plate current is limited and amplification is limited to a factor of about 100. Its purity of tone and limited amplification factor make it ideal for use as a preamplifier tube. And the equal and opposite phase of the outputs from its plate and cathode make it an ideal phase inverter. Now let's move on to the next tube to be developed, which is the Tetrode, which was patented in 1919 by a gentleman named Hiroshi Ando. And Mr. Ando's contribution was to put a shield in the form of a screen grid between the control grid and the plate of the tube. On most tube charts, the control grid will be called G1, the screen grid will be called G2. Now the presence of this shield did away with a couple serious shortcomings of the triode. Number one, it reduced the inter-electrode capacitance from 3.8 picofarads all the way down to a negligible 0.0007 picofarads. Also, the shield allowed higher plate voltages and plate currents to be employed and raised the amplification factor by 6-fold from a mu of 100 all the way up to 600. Now you're probably thinking, that sounds fantastic. How come there are no examples over here of tetrodes that are used in guitar amplifiers? And that's because in this form, as we're going to see, the tetrode is not a particularly usable tube. Now here's where the problem arises. The screen grid is connected to the B+ in the power supply and operates at about the same or slightly below the same voltage as the plate. If the plate is operating at about 400 volts of positive direct current, the screen grid will be at around 380, or can be at the same 400 volts of positive direct current. You may be thinking then, how could this, charged almost the same as the plate, serve as a shield between the control grid and the plate? Isn't it just like we move the plate closer to the control grid? Wouldn't this make the situation worse? Here's how it works. Yes, the plate and screen grid are both charged at very high level, but it's direct current. And as you probably know, direct current does not cause noise or interference with the signal in an amplifier. It's the alternating current that does it. The screen grid does not change. It's charged at a fixed level and it is direct current. The plate, however, if you recall, has an output signal in the form of alternating current that is of significant voltage. That is what disrupts the control grid in the triode. In the tetrode, however, we have a highly charged DC screen grid shielding the control grid from the high AC signal that's coming out of the plate. But the screen grid causes a problem that is actually the downfall of the tetrode. And that is that the screen grid serves at that high positive voltage to accelerate the electrons through the tube. It actually boosts the efficiency, the flow rate of the electrons, and mostly the kinetic energy of the electrons as they pass through the tube. It's sort of like it supercharges the electrons as they travel from the cathode to the plate. Now that may sound like a thoroughly wonderful state of affairs, but as the electrons are accelerated to very high kinetic energy, when they strike the plate, it's just like a cue ball striking a bunch of racked billiard balls. The electrons on the plate, when this high kinetic energy electron strikes, will be knocked off of the plate and will wander around in this area. So for every one high energy electron you have that strikes the plate, you might have 10 or 20 secondary electrons that are knocked loose. Now, a bunch of them will be recaptured by the plate. They will go back to the plate and become part of the output signal. But a significant number of them are going to be attracted to the almost equally positive screen grid. So you're going to end up with a situation where the screen grid is going to steal your signal electrons from the plate, reduce the output signal, and in so doing develop its own current. You could look at it as a competition between the plate and the screen grid for the signal electrons. And every signal electron lost from the plate to the screen is going to be a reduction in our output signal, which is the opposite of what should be happening in an amplifier. Next, the increasing signal and current that are developing here in the screen grid are going to reduce its capability to shield and is going to increase the likelihood of instability within the tube, and eventually even a situation called parasitic oscillation, in which the tube feeds back into itself and oscillates much like a dog chasing its own tail in a circle. And I think you can also see that the higher we raise the plate voltage, the faster the electrons will travel, the harder they'll hit, the more secondary emission there will be, and the more loss there will be. So you'll reach a situation where increasing the plate voltage reduces the plate current. And this is a kind of exotic situation called negative resistance, and it is a big part of why the tube becomes unstable and will develop parasitic oscillation. It's also a big part of why the mu, although 6 times higher, is still limited to 600. As we will see in other tubes that have evolved from the tetrode, the amplification factor can be much, much higher. So in conclusion here, we've taken a giant step forward by adding the screen grid. We've reduced the inter-electrode capacitance. We've increased the mu tremendously. But we've also created a situation called secondary emission, which causes us to develop instability when we try to run our tube at higher plate voltages, and even parasitic oscillation. Now that's why you don't see any examples over here of tetrodes being used in guitar amplifiers. They are not stable. Tetrodes have use in other devices, mainly as oscillator tubes. As you can imagine, any tube that's prone to oscillation, they found a way to capitalize on that, but it's not going to work in an amplifier. Any of you that have ever heard oscillation or acoustic feedback know this is not a good situation. So, In part 2 of this video series, we're going to look at two completely different ways that people sought to eliminate the problem of secondary emission, and the end result being the output tubes that we now see in guitar amplifiers. So stay tuned for part 2, which hopefully will be posted in the very near future. I just want to thank you all for the time you take to watch these videos and to place your generally very interesting and helpful and kind comments. And I hope to see you again in the near future in part 2. Bye for now. Thanks for watching. Hey pup, ready for the ball? Go get it.